Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Champa Patel. I'm the director of the Asia-Pacific program at Chatham House. And it's my great pleasure to invite you to today's discussion where we'll be looking at the Indo-Pacific perceptions, strategies, and partnerships. Now, when we started this project 2 years ago, there was a resurgence of interest in the idea of understanding the region through a new frame that connected the Indian and Pacific Oceans, but also reimagined the political geography of the region. Not just because of China's rise, but also a recognition of the growing political and economic importance of the wider region. Now, Indo-Pacific in this respect is by no means a new concept. Initially promoted by Prime Minister Abe during his first administration, it was really given full expression, first with the 2017 Australian Foreign Policy White Paper, and then subsequently the 2019 US Indo-Pacific Strategy. And since then, we've seen a range of countries develop their own strategies and plans, utilizing what some would argue is quite a nebulous framework. And to this end, Chatham House has been researching strategic perceptions of the Indo-Pacific from the point of view of 7 differing countries. And now through this research, what we see is an evolving picture of the region, fundamentally changed by China's influence, the response to COVID-19, geoeconomic shifts, and much, much more. And what becomes clear is that while there are some convergences of interest, there's also a great deal of divergences in terms of perceptions of what this Indo-Pacific framing means. And that's what we hope to discuss today. How do these perceptions shape or drive foreign policy decision-making? How can shared perceptions support greater collaboration, and in which areas, but also where might divergent views undermine common interests? Just a quick point to note before we get into the discussion: when measuring perceptions, you're always slave to the times in which the discussions took place, and many of our discussions took place prior to the pandemic. And this is a very fast changing and very dynamic context. But I'm confident our discussion today will reflect on these perceptions and illuminate any recent developments and potential pathways forward. So without further ado, I'll hand over now to Cleo Pascal, who's an associate fellow in the Asia Pacific program and with the Energy, Environment and Resources team. And I hope you enjoyed the discussion. I look forward to hearing all of your thoughts. Cleo?
Thank you, Champa. I am incredibly excited to be here to see good friends from around the world. This was a collaborative process. It was a long one and it was complicated. And the people who you see here and who you'll hear soon, Céline Pageant, who helped us on the French side, was our French partner, doesn't have video on, but she'll be able to speak. There's an internet issue. So quickly, some technical issues. This is on the record and the recording will be published on the Chatham House website later this week, possibly next week. So it's not the usual Chatham House rule. Our people will each be speaking one after the other for about 5 minutes, and then they will, in the spirit of the project, which is very much to get people to talk to each other, they will ask each other a question, and then we will open it up for general questions. The general questions can go into the Q&A box. The project itself, interestingly, was funded by the Strategic Policy Unit, the Australian Department of Defence. Nobody has seen the results of this project, including any of the participants here, until it was released yesterday. So if they want to complain, now's the time. But they're not responsible for the contents. It's all my fault. So I'm going to explain a little bit how we put together this project, because it was really quite unusual. What we did was we did roundtables with partner think tanks in 5 of the other countries. And they're going to speak in the order which we held the think tanks. So the first roundtable we held was in Washington at the East-West Center with Satu, who is here and who'll be speaking first. Then we went to the UK and we had it at Chatham House. Then we went to Paris where we had it at IFRI. Then in India, we went to Gateway House, Mumbai. Then we went to the Kingdom of Tonga where the Royal Oceania Institute and Lord Fafanua hosted us. And in Japan, we did a little bit differently. People are more comfortable with the one-on-one conversation. So Hiroki Sakine, who's here, who's seconded to Chatham House and who has a very distinguished career at JBIC, helped arrange a lot of the interviews. And the Indo-Pacific Studies group held a working lunch, a more casual working lunch, which brought together some very interesting people. In each of the locations, the participants were selected in large part by our local think tank. There were people from the country, and in many cases, they were held in the language of the country. So the one in France was held in French, the one in Tonga was held in Tongan. And the idea was very much to get people within those strategic and policy communities to just have a relaxed conversation among themselves about what they think might happen going forward. So the project has, as a result, the main document that was released yesterday, but it will also have meeting summaries from each of those roundtables. And in those meeting summaries, we have essays from each of our partners. In most cases, so Satu wrote one, Lady Fafanua wrote one, Hiroki wrote one, and Gateway House wrote one collectively. So it's really, as a project, it's been a partnership from the beginning, and you're going to see now what that looks like. It changed, as Champa said, we did the field research. Hiroki and I left Japan in March 2020. We were kind of on the last flights getting out. The articles, the essays were written shortly after that. And then we've been following up since then as the situation in Indo-Pacific changed. We were supposed to look forward. What's happened is we've had to look back over the last couple of years to see how that's changed, to see where the momentum is going forward. So without further ado, I would like to begin the presentations. I'll explain a little bit more about each person as I introduce them. Dr. Satu Lemay is the Vice President and Director of the East-West Center in Washington, where he created and now directs the Asia Matters for America initiative. And I think they have one coming out on the Pacific Islands soon, which looks very interesting. He's the founding editor of Asia Pacific Bulletin. He's also senior advisor, China and Indo-Pacific Division at the Center for Naval Analyses in Washington, and senior fellow on Asia History and Policy at the Foreign Policy Institute at the Paul H. Nitz School of International Studies. He's a magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Georgetown University and received his doctorate from Oxford, where he was a George C. Marshall Scholar. And he's a good friend and a great guy, and we're very, very happy to have him here. Satu, please go ahead.
Okay, well, good morning from Washington, D.C., everyone, and thank you, Cleo, for a very warm introduction. Congratulations to Chatham House and to Cleo and the entire team, including my panelists, fellow panelists, for the report and this very interesting and unusual effort. I was so pleased to see it, so pleased to be part of it, and delighted to be here, as I said this morning, from Washington. Look, we have 5 minutes, so I'm going to just really quickly get to the heart of lay down some markers, some questions and some themes that animate the discourse on working with allies and partners in this context of the Indo-Pacific, at least from one American's viewpoint. Needless to say, I do not speak for the US government or any of the organizations to which I'm happily employed by. So, from the US vantage point, I think it's safe to say that COVID dominates the domestic priorities, the new administration, which is now 60+ days into its tenure. So getting our domestic house in order, and that includes health, equity, racial issues, unemployment, all of those fundamental first order issues of our country dominate political discourse. But when you go to the strategic picture, there's no denying that there has been two trends or trajectories that animate the concept of the Indo-Pacific, and hence sort of frame our relations with allies, partners, and other countries in this vast region, running roughly from India east to the west coast of the United States. And as you all know, there's mixed views on whether America's Indo-Pacific concept extends to the East African littoral and et cetera. But those are issues we can discuss. So what are those two themes that dominate? One is that there is a growing consensus, negative consensus about China. This was not the case even as recently as 2-3 years ago. Robert Sutter, whose name many of you will know, was our former director, National Intelligence Officer for East Asia and the Pacific, a very eminent sinologist now at George Washington University. He and I co-authored a report in November 2011. I'm happy to put the link in the chat later, called Hardening US-China Competition and Regional Responses. And what we took away from there is that the hardening on US views of China has come very quickly, it's come very rapidly, and it's come across society, politics, parties, branches of government, etc. And so I think that's the first thing I'd put down a marker on. There is this consensus. The second thing, as I said, is it's a negative consensus, which means there's a lot of support for a hardening US policy, whether that be on human rights, whether that be on Chinese acquisition of high technology, whether that be on reciprocity of openness to media, whether that be related to fair trade, etc. So this combination of these two trends, kind of what I'll call a consensus about the need to be tough on China, combined with this hardening China, has created new baselines in the US approach to China. My own assessment, again, I repeat, 60 days into the new administration with not even the major documents to guide our policy, whether that be the national security strategy. We only have an interim. We don't have a national defense strategy, much less a national military strategy that's been articulated by the new administration. But I think it's fair to say that the new administration has picked up the pieces of these trajectory. And that's very evident in the interim strategic guidance. It's very much clear in the comments of Secretary of Defense Austin relating to the pacing threat of China. However, I just want to note, while there is this consensus in hardening, the new administration's language, and please read it very carefully in the interim strategic guidance, which is a public document, has space in the concept of strategic competition for cooperation. And that language is extraordinarily clear, and it's worth noting because sometimes it's seen as there's no space for working with China. And that document states what that area is. And as you know from the recent Alaska meetings, it remains to be seen where we go. Now, so let me conclude with 3 or 4 questions that animate Indo-Pacific partner and alliance relations in this context. The first is, what is the US willing to do in terms of regional economic competition? As you well know, with the movement forward on RCEP and the CPTPP, the fundamental question is, how does the US remain a critical market and partner on economic as opposed to purely security issues for the region? And how do we work with partners ranging from Japan, India, the Pacific, Southeast Asia, and Europe as well on economic engagement with the region? The second is, how much bandwidth is there for defense increases? As you know, our chairman of the House Armed Service Committee, Mr. Adam Smith, has raised questions about just what the nature of the competition with China should be and how much defense spending should be available. And that debate will go on in the Congress as we move towards the National Defense Authorization Act for 2022, as well as the defense budget going forward. The third is allies and partners, as I have stated in other testimony to the US-China Security and Economic Review Commission. I assess that most countries in the region want to work very hard to stay on the right side of the United States and mostly want to remain merely off the bad side of China. But that is a lot of space within which we have to determine how far our key allies, Australia, Japan, Korea, strategic partners such as India, want to move with us in this competition with China. Are they willing to open up more access, more rotational forces? What does the burden sharing element of defense relations look like? These are questions that will have to be adjudicated and worked with our partners as we go forward. And the final issue relates to just how much our allies and partners are willing to decouple from China in areas of high technology versus other areas. And that remains an open question as well. So as I said, let me just close by saying, we've got China on our mind in the context of Indo-Pacific. It's hardening, there's a consensus about it, but there's still a lot of work to do in working with our allies and partners to make sure that we're on a compatible strategy going forward to make this Indo-Pacific free and open. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Setu. It's a great pace setter. we had in most of the roundtables, a lot of the questions at the time was, what's the US going to do? And now we're starting to see a little bit what the US might do. And the question is, okay, now what's everybody else going to do? A big factor in the Indo-Pacific, which came out more and more as we were doing the research, actually, was France. France is a resident in the Indo-Pacific. It has territories in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific Ocean. It has military assets in the region. It has deep strategic relationships with a lot of the countries in the region. It's been a big seller of defense equipment. Keeps a low profile if you're looking at it from outside the region, but within the region, there's an understanding of the role that France plays. So that was one of the reasons why we went to France for a roundtable. And from France, we have with us Céline Pajon, who is the head of Japan research at the Center for Asian Studies at IFRI, which translates in English as the French Institute of International Relations, Paris. She's an international research fellow with the Cannon Institute for Global Studies in Tokyo and was a visiting fellow at Japan Institute for International Affairs in Tokyo as well. She's a graduate from the Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva and Sciences Po, Lyon. And she studied at Waseda and Osaka universities in Japan as well. Céline is having some internet issues, so she's joined us by phone, for which we're very grateful. And we'll see a lovely picture of her. There she is, Céline. And I have to say, no disrespect to any of the other roundtables, but I think they probably had the best lunch of all of the roundtables. So Céline, please take it away.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the very kind introduction. I must say that I'm very grateful to you and your team to be part of the great project. It was really a pleasure to work with you to set up this roundtable in Paris because I learned a lot from it too. So I'm so sorry not to be able to join by proper video today, but still I'm very happy to be around you. So before starting, I would like to say that usual caveats apply. For me, I'm not representing any official position of France when I'm speaking, not representing any official position of IFRI. I'm just speaking for me, for myself. And so I would like to address the question that you asked me to look at. Being as anything that happened in the past year changed the way you think strategic issues might develop in the region. And so I think many things evolved and happened in the past years, as you know. And obviously, I would start with the same point than Satu highlighted. I think the pandemics and also the way that China actually took advantage of the pandemics to try to advance its game in the region led to a very strong worsening of the image of China in the international scene. Just think about the wolf warrior diplomacy, the case of Hong Kong, how China advanced also in the South China Sea around the Senkaku Islands, the coercive measure vis-à-vis Australia. So all this points to very downgrading perception of China, including in Europe. And as you know, in the last couple of days, we've seen some very concerning phenomenon, very concerning development in Sino-European relations related to all that and to human rights sanctions that was applied by the Europeans to China on the Uyghur issue. So we've seen this more assertive China, but also a kind of a greater reaction, greater pushback to China too. And also, as Satu pointed out, we've seen an hardening of the US China competition, rivalry taking a more ideological turn, so to say. And this hardening competition also lead to more concern regarding a kind of downward spiral of tension or leading to some kind of confrontation in the region. The second element that I noted is the friction between India and China in the Ladakh last year. I believe it really changed India's the position in the region and at least its role in the Quad. We've seen Australia taking part into the Malabar exercise, and we've seen India's being more willing to engage at a higher level, at a deeper level with its Quad partners. We've seen that also with the latest development with the Quad summit of the head of states very, very recently. So this is quite an important turning point, I believe. The third element is the election of Joe Biden, of course, in Washington. So now we expect and we already see a reinvestment of the U.S. in the multilateral setting, and also more consideration given to the allies and partners, and a very strong political willingness to coordinate with them. So this is, again, empowering the Quad, but also I think it's also providing a space also for the Europeans to step in and also to be more active in the region. And actually for the Biden administration, we've seen some declarations saying that the European are kind of crucial partners to try to get in, and to engage in the Indo-Pacific to working. So we see this kind of expectation also for the European in the region. And as you know, this Indo-Pacific debate and discussion has been actually taking momentum in Europe. As you highlighted, France is an Indo-Pacific nation, so it has a sovereign interest, of course, as well as a power interest in the region. But we've seen also other countries such as Germany and Netherlands publishing their own Indo-Pacific outlook at the end of 2020. So that was quite also a development, and now there are some discussion in Brussels about an outlook for the EU in the Indo-Pacific, and it is expected to be published soon. And I think it might be quite modest, but still, if it's published, it will be a big deal, because it's quite an achievement to get the 27 countries with very diversified and different interests in the Indo-Pacific, and also different kind of relationship with China on board, and get a kind of a broad consensus on the basic stance that the EU can advance in the region. And for this, I believe the baseline would be to the EU to try to better, and also to France, of course, to better defend its interest in the region, and not to be caught or to be trapped into the US-China competition. And we will see also 3 European naval deployments this year in the region, if you count the UK aircraft carrier. So that's quite an important development. So I'm not sure if I'm talking too long here. So maybe I will stop here, and I will be very happy to answer to any question on this.
Thank you very much, Céline. That was perfect, really helpful, very interesting, and it was one of the things that came out in the report is that there may or may not be an EU Indo-Pacific policy, as you mentioned, but there definitely is a French one, and it's quite mature and well developed, and it'll be interesting to see how those tracks come together. So thank you. I'm sure there'll be questions. From Paris, we went to Mumbai to Gateway House think tank. We were very, very lucky to be able to work with Gateway House because one of the elements of this new Indo-Pacific architecture that's possibly coming forward through different sorts of partnerships is to try to find new economic options as a result of what's been happening with China. And India is a very potential, useful, agreeable, eager partner in that. So you see that with the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative that's being put together with India, Japan, and Australia. But you saw it particularly around what's happening with the Quad. And at the Quad leaders meeting where they announced that they'd be working together on vaccines, where India can produce it, it can be partially funded by the US and Japan, and distribution can happen with Australia. So it broadens out what partners can do in the region because of what India is, what it has to offer in terms of kind of complexity and economic development and all those things. And so having a partner in Mumbai, which is the economic capital, was very helpful. It gave us a different perspective than you would get if you'd go to Delhi. And Gateway House was a perfect partner for that. There will be a podcast released with the, eventually in the sort of the next couple of days. And just to give you an idea of the sort of discussions that are happening there, one of the people that was interviewed for the podcast was Arun Kumar Gupta, who is the managing director of India Ports Global, which is sort of controlled by the Ministry of Shipping, and they're in charge of developing Chabahar Port in Iran. So the approach towards kind of Indo-Pacific balance coming out of India has been innovative, obviously very long-term, thousands of years. And we learned a lot on that roundtable. And we're very lucky to have from Gateway House with us Samir Patel. He's a fellow in the International Security Studies program at Gateway House. Previously, he was assistant director at the National Security Council Secretariat in the Prime Minister's office in New Delhi, where he handled counterterrorism and regional security issues. Samir has written extensively on various aspects of national security, including counterterrorism, cyber, Kashmir, India-Pakistan, India-China. He's also a dissertation advisor at the Naval War College in Goa. In 2019, he was the recipient of the Canberra Fellowship awarded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia. And he's another good friend and very, very happy to see him here. Thank you for joining us, Samir. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Cleo. Thank you really for giving me the opportunity to be part of this really eminent panel. And congratulations to you, Champa, and the entire Chatham House team for this excellent report on the Indo-Pacific. I'm really happy that, as you mentioned, that we at Gateway House were able to partner with Chatham House to support your field research in India and co-host a workshop in Mumbai in November 2019 with representatives of the Indian businesses and strategic community, along with many of my colleagues. In fact, many of them have joined today as attendees at this webinar. Now, you asked a question about has anything that happened in the past year which has changed the way you think strategic issues might develop in the region. And as some of my co-panelists in Eastern in the Indian Army and British Army has fundamentally recast the Indian thinking about China and how New Delhi views alliances with like-minded countries such as the United States, Australia, and Japan with reference to the wider Indo-Pacific region. If you look at all the steps which India took in the aftermath of the violent clash at Galvan Valley in mid-June 2020, the banning of Chinese apps, restricting the Chinese investment in the Indian startup ecosystem, the Quad meetings, inclusion of Australia in the Malabar naval exercise, and also finally thinking about the ways to exclude Huawei from India's 5G network. I think all those steps singularly demonstrate that Indian policymakers and security establishment perceived Chinese aggression and the brutal violence in Galwan in a fundamentally different manner than the previous India-China crisis and standoff. It, of course, combined with overall skepticism in India about China's evasive response to the origins of the COVID-19 virus and Beijing's handling of the subsequent outbreak of the pandemic. In my view, the Indian leadership has capitalized on the opening provided by the COVID-19 crisis, as evident by India's vaccine diplomacy, the Vaccine Maitri initiative, which so far has provided 60 million doses worldwide. And India has been able to position itself against China's unilateralism, which became particularly starker last year with its werewolf diplomacy, its actions vis-a-vis Taiwan, Hong Kong, South China Sea, and of course, India. One final observation, I think the crisis in Ladakh also made Indian policymakers realize once again the advantage that India has in the maritime domain, particularly when it comes to the broader set of allies and security partners. And this realization has accelerated the process of naval modernization, which has already been undergoing. And I think on Quad, as you mentioned, you can now see a greater willingness coming from New Delhi to discuss non-military yet strategic issues such as vaccine development, cybersecurity, diversification of supply chains, and all that. And in that sense, I think it reinforces the key takeaways of the report. The first one being that concerns about China are getting traction and the emergence of a wider willingness to push back against Beijing. And the second takeaway was that there is a greater drive for international partnerships such as the Quad. My hope that India continues on this path of strengthening its position in the Indo-Pacific, irrespective of the dynamic of the bilateral relationship with China. In other words, I do hope that India doesn't return to its earlier position of an ambivalent attitude towards security competition with China now that the current episode of border standoff has neared its conclusion. My fear, or rather concern, is notwithstanding the growing Indian political willingness to elevate India's profile in the Indo-Pacific, I'm not very sure whether enough resources and budgetary support is available to sustain that profile, at least in the near term. India's overall defense budget has hovered just about 2% of the GDP in the last few years, and that has really been a bane of India's defense modernization, and which has then impact on its profile in the Indo-Pacific. So I'll stop there, and thank you once again for inviting.
Thank you, Samir. That was very interesting and brought up some of the issues that where India has really been a leader. After that, as you mentioned, after the clash at Galwan, after the 20 Indian soldiers were killed in that ambush, one of the first things India did was ban applications, ban TikTok and WeChat. And I think that was a real wake-up call for the strategic community into how comprehensive China's influence operations have been and what needs to be done to actually sort of cut it off. And so yes, you definitely need money for defense. But the understanding of the issue and the creative solutions to it are there. And we've been certainly learning from what India's been doing. So thank you very much for that. And I have to say, I said the food was good in France, but as I'm remembering each workshop, the food was amazing everywhere. So, and the spread that they put on in our next location, the Kingdom of Tonga, was I think it took me a year to take the weight off from that one. That was great. So so in Tonga, so why did we go to the Kingdom of Tonga? The Kingdom of Tonga is in the South Pacific. It's about a 3-hour flight northeast of New Zealand. There's an enormous amount of discussion in strategic communities now about Oceania, about it, but not a lot coming from it. And we were really happy to have the opportunity to work with the Royal Oceania Institute, which is Tonga's first independent think tank, to hear from the people of Tonga what they think about what's going on, because this is an area of high strategic contestation. Tonga alone has, the UK just reopened its High Commission there after not being there for several years. The Nevada National Guard has partnered with the Tongan military. The Tongan military has deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's a lot more going on there than you might think. The Kingdom of Tonga was never colonized. It has a foreign policy community that has managed this sort of geostrategic contestation before, including 120 years ago when the Europeans first showed up in the area and started fighting over the location. And so they know this, and they know what they need to do to try to maintain strategic autonomy. And in many cases, it's family history. And that's why we were really happy to have the Royal Oceania Institute with us, and particularly Lord Fafanu, who's chairman of the Royal Oceania Institute and whose family has been negotiating with foreign powers for decades and occasionally taking over some of the neighboring countries at the same time. Lord Fafanua is became the youngest member of parliament in Tongan history at the age of 24. At the age of 27, he assumed the role of Speaker of Parliament, the youngest ever elected by Parliament in that office in Tonga, and at the time, the youngest Speaker of Parliament in the world. During his term as Speaker, he's still Speaker. He took a break, but he came back. Lord Fafanua sat on the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association Executive as a representative of Australasia and entered the Tongan Parliament into the Interparliamentary Union as the 164th member. Lord Fafanua completed a Master of Arts in Diplomacy, Law, and Business at O.P. Jindal University in India. And he is, as I mentioned, Speaker of the Parliament of Tonga and Chair of the Royal Institute. And it is 3:30 in the morning there, which shows his commitment to his country and to building partnerships. The essay in the field report is written by Lady Fafanua, who is also great and very, very smart. I recommend you read it. So please, Lord Fafanua, thank you very much for being with us. Take it away.
Thank you, Claire. Yeah, it's 3:37 in the morning, so I hope I don't stumble over my words, so please excuse me. I'd just like to congratulate you, Claire, on the excellent work that you've been doing and the output from Chatham House. I understand it takes a lot to cooperate between 7 different countries and also bring us together in this forum. And the research will speak for itself. And the interest in today's launch is evidence of that. I just want to start off by putting some context into the questions that you've given. What are my thoughts? And I just want to say, because I'm Speaker of House, I'm sort of with the government, but I don't speak for the government. I'm speaking on behalf of the Royal Oceania Institute as another Tongan and a fellow speaker on this panel. So obviously, one of the major things that happened in the region in the past year is COVID-19, and everyone's been affected. Fortunately for us, Tonga is one of 7 countries on the planet that doesn't have COVID-19. And I think in terms of the Indo-Pacific region, 5 of those 7 countries are in the Pacific, Tonga being one of them, Palau, Tuvalu, Nauru, and Kiribati, and that's as of the 22nd of this month. So with isolation being a key feature of the Pacific Islands, obviously in the context of COVID-19, that's not such a bad thing. But one of the reasons why we managed to stave off COVID-19 early on was that Tonga's government was able to be quick and effective in reacting to the news and things that were happening around the region. As soon as Fiji had their first imported case, we started to close our borders. And that was the case for most of the Pacific Island countries. So I think it's good credit for small countries who are agile in their governments who were able to respond effectively. And we've managed to maintain that position of COVID-free throughout the whole year up until today. And we hope that this will be a feature of our country up until we have vaccines available. And part of the diplomacy that we're looking to have from India and America and the rest of our traditional partners is to get that vaccine into our populations, and not just Tonga, but the rest of the Pacific as well. Obviously, with the COVID-19 tourism being a big feature of small island nations or large island states, we can't wait for borders to open up again because people are losing their jobs. But one of the key features, because of our traditional resilience in Tonga, people who lost their jobs from tourism managed to go back into subsistence living, back into the crops, and the local markets were reinvigorated. And, you know, we turned away cruise ships, we locked down for 2 weeks. But a year later, we're still, we're not wearing masks. People are not social distancing. Our kids are in school. So things are pretty much normal, but we do feel the effects due to trade and limitations that have been imposed on us from COVID-19 in the greater region. Just looking at you know, what's been discussed by my fellow panelists, engagement versus containment, the greater powers, be it China versus the USA, in terms of how we view what's happening from the Pacific. And I just speak from my own experience. What my colleague Satu said about being, I paraphrase Satu, so please correct me if I get it wrong, but we do want to be on the right side of the USA, and we also want to be on the good side of China. But one advantage that China does have in the Pacific region is they have diplomatic representation. We have 4 missions in our country. We have the Japanese embassy, we have the British High Commission, which recently reopened after a long break from Tonga, and that was probably due to Brexit. We have Australia, we have New Zealand, and we are missing the United States. And we are also missing representation from India. And this would be probably the most effective, down-to-earth, concrete measure to a formal alliance or to counter what you view as the influence of other potential partners in the region. This contestation on the ground needs to be concrete, and we need to have representation from the USA and from China, and from India. In terms of France, yes, they're a regional player. France has stake in the Pacific. We share a boundary with France and with the USA and with New Zealand. But we can only make friends with those who we see on a regular basis. And I think that's probably one of the outcomes that I would like to see out of this. Is a question I want to ask Satu is, why isn't the United States in more Pacific Island countries? Is it because they use de facto partners that they outsource in the region? Is it because they rely on others, such as our traditional partners? Because this is something that's felt on the ground here, and one that I think would be important to be answered. So just going back to one of your questions, Cleo, that you gave us, what are our fears? Obviously, we fear another global pandemic. And a major fear that we have in all Pacific countries, and that's important to us, is unabated climate change. And this agenda needs to be answered. Like, where does the United States position itself with climate change? And in terms of the new regime administration, will the United States be a global leader for climate change adaptation and for measures to mitigate? Most Pacific countries are at the forefront. During the COVID pandemic, we came through tropical category 5 cyclone. And during our lockdowns, we had to lift the lockdown because certain communities in our islands were affected by king tide and flooding. And, we're not just dealing with the pandemic here, we're also there's a larger picture in terms of climate change, and it's real. And that's an existential threat to us. So in terms of security, it's something that is important for the Indo-Pacific, and I'm sure the rest of the countries and panelists would agree with me. I understand my time's probably running out. As speaker, I appreciate the 5 minutes I've been given, so I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you, Cleo.
Very much, Lord Fafanu. I hope your parliamentarians are as respectful of time limits as you've been. I'd like to reinforce something that Lord Fafanu said, which was we had our roundtable in Nuku'alofa in February 2020. So word of COVID was just starting to get out. While we were there, the Ministry of Health made a decision to start turning away cruise ships. It was one of the first countries to do it. They had their understanding of the situation and quick action and decisiveness means that Tonga is now one of the few countries in the world without COVID. Similarly, their unique land system with a lot of communal land has allowed people who had been unemployed because of the tourism sector collapse to go back to the countryside and to go back essentially to a barter society. We have a problem from the outside looking in because none of this shows up in GDP numbers or in statistics. In fact, it looks like it's not as economically stable as it is, but it has much more resilience than many of the other larger countries that are much more kind of look on paper like they're doing better. So we were particularly grateful, as I mentioned, to the Royal Oceania Institute and to the participants of the roundtable for helping us to understand the unique resilience in the Tongan system and what we can learn from them. So thank you very much, Lord Fafanua. Flights were still going, so we managed to fly off to Japan, getting in just under the line, where we held a series of one-on-ones, and we had a working lunch roundtable organized by the Indo-Pacific Studies Group That's Dr. Reiko Hayakawa's group. It was incredibly interesting, very complicated time. Government ministers kept disappearing to go to COVID meetings, trying to figure out what to do about some of those issues. And we were really lucky that Hiroki Sekine, who was had just recently been seconded to Chatham House, just came to join us at Chatham House, came back to Japan to help us with the interviews and help us understand Japan. Hiroki is a visiting fellow in the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House. He's also been a non-resident visiting fellow at the Institute for Security and Development Policy at Stockholm since he's still there since February 2020. He was director of the Policy and Strategy Office for Financial Operations at the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, who do a lot of kind of not quite as well known, but very, very influential and important work across the Indo-Pacific. He then served as a senior advisor to the corporate planning department at JBIC until December 2019. Japan's engagement in the Indo-Pacific is, as one of the main originators of the concept as we have it now, the free and open Indo-Pacific, has been very influential. And Japan as a country, again, keeps its profile quite low, but the engagement with India is deep and long. The engagement with the Pacific Islands is very important. And we're really happy that Hiroki could join us and tell us a bit more about it. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Claire. And good afternoon and good evening. And I think that good early morning. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here to discuss the very important issues in the Pacific. Regarding recent key development, which might change the course of geopolitical and geoeconomic landscape in the Indo-Pacific, I think that they may be the progress of Quad cooperation and UK's shift to Indo-Pacific region. I would like to more highlight on the geoeconomics rather than geopolitics. Looking back the last 1 year, I think Hong Kong issue and border conflict between China and India and revised China Coast Guard law from Japanese perspective drove the shift of Indo-Pacific geopolitical landscape. Quad meeting, actually first ever summit level meeting held on March 12, confirmed commitment to promoting a free, open, and rule-based order which shared the vision for free and open Indo-Pacific. But the most importantly, Quad launched vaccine partnership, where the partnership will work together to deliver vaccine for COVID-19 across the region. Quad also launched Quad Climate Working Group and Critical and Emerging Technical Working Group. That signaled that Quad would like to address the not only security issues, but also much broader regional agenda, including climate change or innovation. That would be the clear shift from the traditional way to behave in the Indo-Pacific for India, the other countries. So Quad is changing. When it comes to the UK, UK-Japan 2+2 meeting this February not only confirmed to elevate defense cooperation between two countries in the region, including aircraft carrier Queen Elizabeth's visit to East Asia this year, but also confirmed persistent cooperation on much broader agenda, including very important issue 5G and humanitarian assistance, quality infrastructure promotion, or gender mainstreaming. Those progress suggests alliance among those shared common vision might expand its role more to economic or development agenda in the Indo-Pacific. That's a new signal, I think. US-Japan, in this context, has been working on energy or infrastructure development cooperation for the Indo-Pacific. For example, US-Japan is advancing strategic energy partnership, and most recently, last December, US-Japan-Vietnam held trilateral commercial LNG forum, where the parties discussed LNG solution to promote further energy transition in Vietnam, including actual project developments or finance. Another example is trilateral partnership for infrastructure investment led by US DFC and JAVIC, Export Finance Australia, and Australian Foreign Department. The partnerships actually jointly supported submarine telecommunication cable deployment in Palau this year. So we can see the development in the economic perspective. With the view to such ongoing partnership between US, Japan, and Australia, as well as new role of Quad and UK's increasing interest in the region, I expect the alliance over free, open Indo-Pacific will play more significant role in the regional economic agenda, which historically global community has worked together through multilateral institutions or bilateral cooperation. But this new forum may produce complexity when it comes to harmonization. But in the end, the region may benefit from these new fora like Quad cooperation, US, Japan, Australia, or competition over support to the region. We have to think of the BRI. If the region can maintain stability even in political, strategic, economic competition, overall, the future landscape of Indo-Pacific is promising. On the other hand, we have to worry about complete division across the region. Yeah, actually, it should be a disaster that the current tension will move ahead to what we call Cold War or even military conflict, regardless of the small scale or not. But I think that there are a lot of questions about that, actually. But I think that can be wisely avoided, given that in reality, mutual economic reliance across the world, including China. A lot of trade deal between US and China and Japan and China. We have to think about the reality. But we should be very careful about the future trajectory. Okay, I will stop there. So I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Sukune-san. It was a great pleasure to be able to learn from you when we were in Japan, and especially about how Japan is focusing on this economic component, which is fundamental. Because as you said, if the concern is China, one of the main ways China engages, initially at least, is economic. So if countries like the Kingdom of Tonga aren't offered an economic alternative or other economic structures, then it's in their own self-interest, at least initially, to go for that Chinese engagement. And Japan has been very interesting around LNG and around infrastructure development and trying to create alternatives that actually do create more stability and prosperity, which can benefit a free and open Indo-Pacific. So thank you very much for your time. We've gone through the panelists, and you get a bit of a sense of what it was like to do this project. And I mean, just very quick overview of what we saw as the development of the discussion. So when we were going through, and remember this is late 2019 to kind of early 2020, what we found in most of the countries, and it's been brought up by a lot of the discussants, is there were three factors that we kept seeing. One was there was a lot of internal division, especially between the business community, the economic community, the political community, who were pro-Chinese engagement for economic reasons, and the defense, security, intelligence communities who were much more cautious. And that division you found in pretty much almost every country. There was also an enormous amount of uncertainty. So if you go back to that time, if you remember, there was the US election was coming up. Prime Minister Abe eventually, unfortunately, had to leave office. Brexit was coming up. There were a lot of major things going on that meant the political calculations in each country were uncertain. In fact, one of the participants at the US roundtable said there were more balls in the air than at any time since World War II. So the result of that domestic division and the uncertainty was there was a lot of hedging going on, a lot of do we, don't we, how do we manage this China relationship US-China relationship. India was a big example of that. But as time developed and these things that our panelists have so eloquently discussed came into effect, the COVID, but particularly the response to COVID, the economic effects of the COVID lockdown, the attack in the Himalayas, the aggression in the South and East China Sea, Hong Kong, the major military exercises off of Taiwan, all of these activities on the part of China, we started to see much less internal division. So the people who are concerned about China got much more space in the discussion. And there was less uncertainty. A lot of those big things happened. The US election happened, Brexit happened, the sky didn't fall. And the result is there's been less hedging. And as we get less hedging, we're starting to see much, much more desire for partnerships. And so you see the Quad really taking off. And the clear focus on the Indo-Pacific. Secretary of Defense, US Secretary of Defense Austin just went to Japan and South Korea, and then went to India to sort of figure out how things can work out there. So there's continuity in that, and it is becoming much more clear that the era of hedging may be decreasing and the era of partnerships may be increasing. And in that context, we are, again, particularly grateful that the people on the panel can join us, because these are some of the critical elements going forward. This is all in the report. I need the report. There's also going to be a separate product, which will be out soon, which will be country reports from each of the countries that goes more in depth into how everybody talked about it. And there'll be podcasts. I'll talk about it a bit at the end. So now we're going to go to the kind of inter-question thing. And Lord Fafanoa kicked us off. So we will go through the order that everybody spoke, but we're going to just jump in first. Satu, do you feel like answering Lord Fafanoa's question?
Yes. First of all, let me express my appreciation to all the presentations. Really learned a lot and grateful. I just wish I could have joined all the sessions, because it was terrific to hear from colleagues across the region. Yes, on Lord Fakafuna's question regarding the Pacific, you're quite right. I'll flag a couple of things. First, over the last couple of years, there has been a definite upward interest in the Pacific as a whole. So I'll flag that that's across the US government, the whole of government. Second, as you know, we have what are called freely associated states relationships in the Pacific with Republic of Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau, Republic of Palau. And those compacts are up for renegotiation in 2022 and 2023. So that's going to be a source of great interest and activity, already has been. In that context, I would note that for the first time ever in US congressional history, and this is very significant if you understand the US democratic system, Congress both authorizes and appropriates funding, has formed a Pacific Islands caucus in the House of Representatives, led by bipartisan membership. And that's a really forward-looking move to pay regular attention to the Pacific through legislation, authorization, and funding. On your specific issue about diplomatic presence, as you well know, I had the great pleasure to work with Ambassador Sella, who went out to represent us in the region under the last administration, and I'm sure will be ably represented in the future across the region. But you're quite right. The Congress is looking at increasing the State Department's budget to provide more diplomatic activities and diplomatic representation. Where exactly that will be, which countries it will be allocated to, is far beyond my ken. But clearly that discussion of expanding our diplomatic presence across the region and the world, for that matter, is very much under discussion in the now Democratic controlled House and Senate. So I'm looking forward to more opportunities. The one thing I would end by saying is it's really important for the US. We think of our approach to the Pacific in the following way. As you well know, we have 3 territories in the Pacific: Guam, the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, and American Samoa, and then through the compact or freely associated states into the Pacific. And given the recent developments at the Pacific Islands Forum, relating to the leadership of the Pacific Islands Forum. There's some question in Washington exactly where the grouping of Pacific Island countries would like to go and where we can be most efficacious and helpful in that process. So we're looking at that issue. I know Cleo is joining us later in the week for a discussion on elements of this issue. So I welcome your guidance, and I look forward to further conversations with you to have a better understanding of how the South Pacific can be better integrated into our largely North Pacific and US territorial approach to the region. Thank you so very much for the query.
Satu, do you want that to be your question to Lord Fafanua? Do you want the...
Sure.
Lord Fafanua, do you want to answer? We've actually had some questions also in the question box about the PIF and about what that could mean for regional security. So I think it dovetails quite nicely.
Yeah, no, I think it's very encouraging what you say about the Pacific Island Caucus and Congress, and that's very encouraging. But in terms of how it actually affects the South Pacific, is still evident. But as you mentioned, you do have a compact with the Northern Pacific Islands, Palau, and but what we've seen in the Pacific Islands Forum with this divide between the North and the South shows that there is a clear separation and divide between North and South Pacific Island countries. And that's where I think the gap needs to be plugged by the United States, probably through bilateral arrangements. And it's good that you're going to flag this, because North Pacific, it's good, it's fine. We know that there's compacts, we know that there's bilateral arrangements between those countries and the United States, but where the gap is in the South Pacific, and especially in Tonga and Samoa and some of the other countries in the South Pacific Island countries. So I appreciate what you're saying, and I think this is a conversation that's worth having. But the funding money shows that there is commitment from the United States, and it's good to see the Congress take that step.
Thank you very much, Lord Fafanua. Yeah, one of the things that came out during the discussions was how interested the U.S. is becoming in the region, and also how deep and interested Japan's engagement has been, especially in the North, but also all across. As Lord Fafanua mentioned, one of the few foreign diplomatic missions in Tonga is Japan. And I think we might start to see more collaboration between the U.S. and Japan, at least in the North Pacific, but the Southern Pacific gets into a bit of complications with the allies of Australia and New Zealand, and that's a longer discussion to be had at another time, maybe. Céline, do you have a question for anybody else on the panel?
Hello, hi again. Cleo, if you allow me, I actually had a question for you. Because you're standing with the Chatham House, so I was wondering how you see the global Britain fit in all this. Sekine-san also touched upon this a little bit, so if he wants to chip in also, of course, is welcome. But I would be interested to get your view after the integrated review. How do you see the Britain actually tilt or stronger pivot or push in the Indo-Pacific? And as maybe a follow-up to Satu's question on how far the U.S. allies would be willing to go and to work with the U.S. How do you see the special relationship between Britain and U.S. Navigate the Indo-Pacific, working in the Indo-Pacific? Thanks.
This is the problem with working with smart people, is they notice the gaps in your system. So sorry, did notice we don't have anybody from the UK here. We did the UK roundtable, and we didn't actually even have an expert write about it because we were so caught up in our own heads. So then it's a very good point. And for those following, the UK did release its integrated review, highly anticipated integrated review, very inconveniently, like the day we were supposed to release the report. So we're quickly rewriting and typesetting. But I have to say, in terms of Indo-Pacific, that stuff happens all the time. There are changes now that are happening so quickly. The Quad leaders meeting and it's moving really fast. for those who haven't had the chance to read it, there is a section there called Indo-Pacific Tilt, where the UK is talking about engaging more in the region. And there is much more defense procurement, including in terms of cooperating with the US. So the new Queen Elizabeth carrier group will be going out through the Indo-Pacific and to Japan with US F-35s and Marines embarked on it. And it's going to Japan because Japan is a high priority area for collaboration for the UK. But there's also an attempt to try to build up the India relationship as well. Prime Minister Johnson will be going to India. It's anticipated in April. That relationship has languished for a lot of reasons, and we may start to see some movement there. The review is also kind of clear that there's still a desire to economically engage with the UK to quite a large degree, and I think that goes back to this issue that we found right at the beginning of the report of internal divisions. How do you deal with China? And I would encourage more watching rather than reading. Just watch the actions rather than read the papers at this point, because I think there's a lot happening that may not be written about. So, for example, the statements that were made about Hong Kong or about the Canadians who are being held hostage in China, that sort of thing. That's showing a little bit more fortitude than might be indicated by the review. But I don't know if Champa, who's director of the Asia Pacific program here and who's actually based in London, I'm in Miami. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
No, I'm not going to add anything to that other than it's an area where the House has been engaging, and there are a number of experts working across different programs who have contributed to the thinking in that, and then analysing the various aspects of what we've seen in the integrated review. It's very fresh, so people are still digesting what it might mean in practice, but I'm conscious of the time, so I want to make sure we have as much time for questions as possible, so I'll leave it there.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions, so we'll kind of run through the panels. Samir, do you have any questions for anybody?
Well, one of my questions actually is anyone in the panel is to say that actually that beyond bilateral diplomacy and national strategies, how easy or difficult it will be for the Indo-Pacific as a construct to survive in the absence of a formal institutional mechanism or architecture?
Hiroki, do you want to take that? Because since Japan was one of the originators of the concept, do you want to talk a little bit about, is there an institutionalization coming? In India, there's a lot of discussion about how to institutionalize the Quad, for example. And Japan's been a leader on that.
Yeah, exactly. I explained in my presentation that Japan is leading the economic collaboration together with US and Australia. That has a history. So the one idea is just Japan can expand that capacity in the partnership with India, or combine such partnership within the Quad, or even with UK or France. So I think that there is a lot of space to collaborate in terms of the economic agenda across the region. So one of the opportunity is that, or possibility is that might be, we can expand the current trilateral partnership to much wider entry from the like-minded partner. That would be the one. So.
And I think Samir was asking what happens if you don't get the institutions. Does it survive? Do the relationships survive if it doesn't get institutionalized?
It's a very tough question, but I think that's kind of cooperation or soft type of cooperation will survive because we share the vision or common value across the like-minded partner. Based on that, we can continue such kind of the soft partnership even without pure solid institutionalized organization. That's my opinion. If we set up the organization, that situation might become much more complicated. We have multilateral institution, we have bilateral institution, a lot of institutions there. So that's my opinion. To avoid such complex process, I think that the current type of the partnership would be working very well, at least in my view.
Thank you, Tsukine-san. And it's your turn to ask a question.
Yeah, but given the time constraint, I think that you can take up the question from the audience, because I saw a lot of questions even to me. So
okay.
I'd like to add some explanation about 5G cooperation, because I saw the question from the audience. Okay, I mentioned 5G in the context of the Japan-UK cooperation. I think that in the vision of Global Britain, in my understanding, the UK would like to lead the global agenda, taking advantage of the presidency of G7 or other place. So one of the priority is 5G collaboration. UK pursue to form a sort of the alliance or coalition to ensure the open solution. We call the open LAN. So that is a kind of the technology to get more diversified supply chain in the field of 5G. So UK, Japan agreed to work together to pursue such opportunity or potential. And Japan and India in the Quad that agreed to pursue such a future opportunity. So all together, Japan is in a position to be a kind of the broker to join the UK, Japan, and the Quad. But in the end, you can play a vital role in leading the 5G agenda, at least. That's the answer to that question by audience. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you, that was very helpful. And we will start now turning to some more of the audience questions that I think we're at like 50 questions. So we're not going to get to all of them, but I think it shows the interest in the topic and the range of expertise on the panel. So thank you all very much for that. This question, I'll give it to Céline, which is France always emphasized about its national interests as an Indo-Pac nation. At the same time, other European nations also published their strategies in the region, as you mentioned, Germany and the Netherlands, for example. Will we see more European joint engagement in the region soon?
Yes, thanks, Cleo. Yes, as I briefly mentioned in my presentation, the EU is now working on a joint position, a European position in the Indo-Pacific. So this is in itself a very important development. So we're still waiting, but it should come rather quickly. We can also expect that we'll see some coordination at the occasion of the dispatch of the naval dispatch this year by France, Germany, and the UK at some point. We will see maybe if we can make some joint port calls or exercise together. Obviously, with this European, Indo-Pacific outlook, it will make a very good starting point to see more coordinated action in this area, especially if you look at the EU level. The EU has the competence on all initiatives related to connectivity, which is really a key agenda in the Indo-Pacific. There is already a EU-Asia connectivity plan, but I believe it still needs to be fleshed out. There is a EU-Japan connectivity partnership also, so that's opening ways for the EU and for European countries to work together and to coordinate more in the region. So that would be my short answer.
Thank you. That's very helpful. We're also getting a lot of questions about the Quad. So Samir, if you'd mind, I'll direct this one at you, because India has always been a very important and complicated player in the Quad. But the activities that we've seen over the last year or so, the signing of BECA, inviting Australia to Malabar, the joint, the Tiger Triumph exercises. We've seen a very different India. As you said, post-June 2020, post-Galwan, things seem to have really changed. So the question, there have been several questions about the Quad, but one of them that seems to come up is about membership, is going to increase membership, and just generally what you think about how it's going.
I think there is a merit in expanding the membership of the Quad. Maybe Quad something like a free and open Indo-Pacific alliance or something like that kind of thing, which can then. But there is a merit in expanding, particularly countries such as France, which are a resident of the Indo-Pacific and have a strong presence in the region. So that's the answer to the whether membership of the Quad can be expanded. About how Quad is going, I think the fact that the Biden administration has decided to convene the Quad summit, it would mean that there is a merit now to take forward this initiative, and the fact that they decided to work on issues which to go beyond the anti-China agenda, to focus on some of the issues such as 5G, and then probably the later technologies, climate change, would indicate that I think from the US, the sense which is coming is that they want to take Quad beyond anti-China to make it an anchor of the Indo-Pacific security partnership. And I think that is what it will, and I think that is what will sustain Quad in the long term. And therefore, I think that makes sense for the Quad.
Thank you, Samir. We're getting a lot of questions for Lord Fafanua. I think it's a rare treat to have somebody from the Pacific actually explaining to us what's going on there, as opposed to through proxy or something. So I'm going to read two of them, and then you can answer them how you like. The UK Indo-Pacific tilt was light on details on the Pacific. What role would you like to see the UK play in the region? That's one. Another is, aside from the presence of the Chinese embassy in Tonga, what other differences, if any, have you noticed in the diplomatic and strategic approach of the US versus China to Tonga and other Pacific Island countries?
Thank you, Claire, and I'd like to thank the audience for the question. With the first one about UK Indo-Pacific framework, okay. The UK's role in the South Pacific. I think South Pacific would like to see more support from the UK for climate change adaptation mitigation. That's always a priority from the South Pacific. And secondly, with the UK as a financial center, I think there's an opportunity there for the UK to facilitate capital investment into South Pacific. That's always one of the largest constraints for economic development, is access to capital. And I think that's probably a potential avenue for diplomacy from the UK. And just to give you an idea of what we're seeing in the Pacific, since around November 2020, we've seen a hardening in the insurance market in the region. And that's meant developments across the Pacific have sort of had to find insurance. And without insurance, there's no financing. Without financing, you're dead in the water. And all the underwriters that we've managed to trace go back to London. So one solid thing that the UK can do in the South Pacific is free up insurance through your underwriters so that we can have our developments for mitigation, adaptation, or climate change. We're talking about renewable projects and other development projects. To the second question about the Chinese embassy and the differences in the approach between China and the US, one thing that comes to mind is that there's no substitution for face-to-face interaction. When we need something in Tonga, we can walk into an embassy and ask for it. And the Chinese, 99% of the time, oblige. And in a time of need, when Tonga needed funding to rebuild our capital, China was the only country who gave us a soft loan at the time. And even though Tonga is indebted to China, we're committed to paying back that loan, even though there's rhetoric around the region of debt traps and all sorts. But China was there when we needed. And that's probably the biggest approach and probably the most hard-hitting one for the US to hear.
Thank you. That I think made both Samir and I smile, because one of the things that came up at the Indian Roundtable was insurance industry and issues with London around that, also around building I think part of merchant fleet. It was a whole other separate, very interesting discussion. And this is why getting you to talk to each other is great. It's very, very helpful.
Yeah, I wish I was at that panel.
And in fact, and that's another thing that came up a lot in the Tonga panel, is how much they wanted to work more with India, and saw a lot of compatibilities there. We're getting questions about ASEAN, and India is very keen to ensure ASEAN centrality in the developing Indo-Pacific construct. Japan is extremely engaged with ASEAN as well, and the US is trying to figure out how to do it. So who would like to take the ASEAN question?
I was going to say that ASEAN is not my area of expertise, but I think, the fact is that the ASEAN has taken a very nuanced stand on the Indo-Pacific, where they are saying, that they are interested in this region, but at the same time, not specifically mentioning China. I think that itself is a very interesting manifestation of where ASEAN is coming from. And I think, but if you look at the ASEAN itself, I think what has happened over the last few years is that China has been able to exploit the differences, the intra-regional differences within ASEAN to its advantage. And that therefore today ASEAN actually stands as a very beaconed organization. And that has grave implications for the entire Southeast Asia.
Hiroki, do you want to add something to that?
Yes. I think if you look at the statement, joint statement of 2+2 Japan, US, and UK, Japan, or Quad document, they always say that we respect the ASEAN centrality and unity and ASEAN outlook for the Indo-Pacific. So that's the start point of the relationship with ASEAN. It's not a good idea to push them to take side between China and the other. So ASEAN wants to develop itself in the very united region. And ASEAN is facing some challenges, urgent challenges, including climate change. So I think that it should be the wise idea for us to propose some smart idea to get the smooth transition in time when it comes to climate change. If that agenda is different, we have to propose other, solution. So such kind of the relationship is important to avoid further division across the region. So that should be the position, I guess, of Japan. And yeah.
Thank you very much. So we have 6 minutes left. So what we'll do, I think, is just go back through the panel. If anybody has any remarks on what they've heard or questions you want to pick up from the chat box or whatever you like, the time, such as it is yours. So back in the row that we did it. Satu, would you like to kick us off?
Well, sure. There are so many terrific questions in the Q&A session, and my fellow panelists have made so many interesting and intriguing remarks. Let me offer a couple of big thoughts, sort of my takeaway. First, I've always thought there are kind of 4 sets of relations in the Asia Pacific. There's US relations with its partners, allies and partners. There's kind of China's relations with various countries. There's intra-Asia relations, i.e. country relationships that don't involve the US or China. Korea, Japan, India, Japan. You can think of lots of them, right? That course through. My own sense is that the trajectory of US-China relations is hardening to such an extent, and we remain to see where it goes, that this is going to heavily impact US-Asia relationships and intra-Asia relationships. Let me give you concrete examples. Japan is hesitant about expanding the G7 to include South Korea, but is very supportive of the Quad. My point in saying this is not to flag that this is a difference, but to flag that we're going to have to get used to working on multiple levels. And Hiroki makes a great point about ASEAN. We can't expect black and white, clear-cut views. We're going to expect working with countries in order to meet their national interests. And for a country like the United States on the ASEAN question, we have two treaty allies, Thailand and the Philippines. We have growing strategic partnerships across Southeast Asia, including the very important strategic partnership with Singapore, which people sort of underplay or underweight how important that is to our forward posture. So I think we're going to have to start getting used to a jumbling of relationships which aren't clearly drawn. Japan may disagree on expanding G7, but will be very supportive on Quad. ASEAN claimant states will be very engaged in maritime security initiative with the US and its partners, but not want to be too forward-leaning and thumbing their noses at China. Just look at the recent ASEAN Survey 2021 on attitudes towards China have declined precipitously in Southeast Asia. Let me say on India that we very much see a trend, I don't want to say we, I see a trend where India continues to talk autonomy, will have to talk autonomy, but is walking the walk of alignment. And so we're going to be seeing, it's not an alliance, it's not agreeing with everything the US or Japan or Australia or others do, but it's more aligned. It wants to work and is looking for ways to work with the Quad and other arrangements. So if I have a picture to give, is that in a time of great contestation, geostrategically, but also to go back to your findings of your report, a time of great uncertainty, and that was on the cusp of COVID. And we're far from over from COVID globally, much less in the Indo-Pacific. Let's get used to a not single strategy or a single solution, but rather building an order that has certain principles, that has certain values, that has certain long-standing relationships. And on those build, rather than try to put everything into a clean, neat, cutout box. So let me stop there.
Thank you. That's good advice. Céline, any quick last comments?
Sure. I really concur with what Satu just said. I think we are going for a multi-layered and very complex order in the Indo-Pacific. So I think we need to keep any, kind of coordination, cooperation mechanism as flexible as possible in a kind of, ad hoc manner. I guess we will see more of issue-based grouping or coalition that would make the country easier to come together and to coordinate when they feel the need to, when their interest and principle and value concur, and and to make it both legitimate in their eyes and both efficient also, kind of efficient multilateralism. So institutionalization in this way, we are talking about the institutionalization of the Quad, it might be actually quite counterproductive. We need really to keep this flexibility. As an example, I would take the example of France, because France have been invited to join the Quad or to associate formally with the Quad, and it had been quite reluctant to do so. But in action, what you see is that France has a very strong, strategic partnership or alliance with the 4 members of the Quad, and it conducts regular exercise, trilateral exercise with Japan and the US, even recently on anti-submarine warfare. So. Yeah, why make things complicated? If France is more comfortable on advancing and deepening the partnership this way, and not being formally associated with one mechanism which is not comfortable with, well, that should not be a big issue. So yeah, let's keep it this way. I think all the geostrategic environment in the Indo-Pacific is still very, very fluid. It's changing day by day. So all the countries are just, trying to adjust their position. So we should stay flexible on this too.
Thank you, Sinan. We're officially out of time, but we're going to just go through the rest of the panel very quickly, if that's okay. Samir, any last comment?
No, I just want to add to what Satu said about India's strategic autonomy. I think that will remain a feature of Indian foreign policy, even for the foreseeable future. I think that is India's exceptionalism when it comes to Quad, because whereas the three countries of the Quad are former military allies, India will remain a security partner for these countries, and India will continue to emphasize that particular status as it approaches Quad and some other regional groups. Thank you.
Great. Wow, that was quick. Thank you. Lord Fafanua?
Thank you. Just quickly, I think I completely agree with what Satu was saying. But just to add to that, I think multifaceted approaches, nuanced, and also prioritizing national interests. That's probably the successful way to approach for meaningful win-win alliances for sustainable development in the region, Indo-Pacific, and also for the nationals. And then just the last thing I want to say is for these concrete relationships to be meaningful and to actually mean something, I'm repeating myself, must be a delirium. We need USA and India representation. That's probably the bottom line. So thank you.
Yeah, that's not repeating yourself. That's making a very important point that everybody needs to hear. So thank you very much. And it's also 4 a.m. I think probably there.
4:30.
4:30. Sorry, thank you. Hiroki?
Okay, I just want to echo the statement of the other panelists. So Indo-Pacific agenda is moving very quickly, but we have to ensure what's the value, what the common value is, and what the urgent agenda across the region is. So very flexibly, we should cooperate to tackle with the urgent agenda across the region. That's the solution to avoid further complication and the negative movement towards the conflict. So that's my final statement. But it's a very shame that I couldn't answer every question posed to even me. I saw a lot of my name in the question box, but I'm very sorry for not answering the question raised by the audience at the moment. Thank you.
And that's a good point. I think that it goes to show how much interest there is and how much people want to understand each other more, and hopefully we'll continue this this conversation. And I just want to thank you all. This has been a taste of what this project has been like for the last year and a half. Smart people who care about their own countries and making the world a safer, more prosperous, more secure place. The conversations have been astounding. The food has been great. So I'd like to thank the SATU, the East West Center, the Institut Français de Relations Internationales, IFRI, Françoise, Nicolas, and Céline, Gateway House, Manjit and her amazing team, the Royal Ishini Institute, Lord Fafanua, Lady Fafanua, Mane Kite, their incredible team, the Indo-Pacific Studies Group in Japan, Dr. Hayakawa and Sakine-san and his incredible colleagues, Australian Department of Defense, who probably got more than they bargained for with this one. At Chatham House, obviously, Anna, Anthony, Champa, Ruth Quinn, Chloe. It's been a privilege and a pleasure. I would encourage you to see the report. And in the next few days, we're going to have the field reports, which go much more into depth into the 6 countries, not China. There's a China box in the main one, but the 6 countries that we visited today will have specific reports. And there'll be a podcast, which will have interviews again with some of the great minds that we met along the way, including Admiral Morissetti, Bill Hayton, who put out a great book on China recently, Verley Nguyen's, Captain Alok Bansal, Ambassador Latu. It was a very interesting interview. He's the Tongan ambassador to China, if people are interested in that relationship. Admiral Koda. It's been an incredible couple of years, and I just want to say thank you, merci, Danyavad, malo pito, domo arigatou gozaimasu, your colleagues and friends, and I've learned an enormous amount from you. Thank you very, very much.